بسم الله والحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله. We have a situation that every time something takes place in Philadelphia, immediately the commentary is, how can there be so many Muslims in that city, and what goes on transpires or takes place? We have within the general society at this time two extremes with regard to human behavior, and the Muslims themselves have begun to incorporate this type of thinking into how they look at the world. And one is that side which says the problems that we experience are as a result of environment, the way the environment impacts and institutions. And the other extreme is what you see right now coming up with the right, wherein people talk about individual responsibility, they talk about blaming the parents and so on and so forth, so that the parents have to take responsibility, the individuals have to take responsibility, so everything comes back down to solely individual responsibility. When we look at the reality of the situation that was taking place in Mecca in the time period of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ at the earliest stages, one of the things that we have to understand is that the Prophet ﷺ, in the initial stages of the da'wah, didn't just allow anybody to come into the circle of the deen. People were being prepared to be able to handle the responsibility of the da'wah, and when a certain set of conditions was in place, then the Prophet ﷺ opened up the da'wah to be able to incorporate other people. And when the Prophet ﷺ began to openly engage the da'wah, there was what we would like to say in our language, there was a crew behind the Prophet. There was a group of people that was not bickering about the deen. There was not a group of people that was uncoordinated, misaligned, internally disruptive. It was a group of people that understood the concept of ta'awanu ala al-birri wa taqwa wa la ta'awanu ala al-ithmi wal udwan. Cooperate in goodness without qualification. All that is good. All that is good. Cooperate in that. And support each other in establishing what's foundational in the deen. And that's the reality of taqwa. And one definition is establishing the fundamentals of the deen. Bir is that which exceeds the basic expectations of doing good. And so in Islam, you could turn the other cheek if you wanted to. It's good. Or you can get your right. Both options exist. And every situation is not to be measured to be the same. In any event, there was a foundation for a community to be built. So when we have to understand, and sometimes I listen to people, a lot of times they're not from Philly. They go to Philly, they move to Philly, or they talk about Philly from, the outside, and they don't understand the culture in Philly. Philly has a generational culture just like Chicago has a generational culture. The only thing that is a difference between Philly and Chicago is the whole issue of the group. Philly is much more individualistic. But you have generations, their uncles and cousins, they're on the corner of the block. And they've been on the corner of the block. And they've been in the same neighborhood for years, generations. So if you go into some neighborhoods in Philly, you have whole sections where families dominate in those neighborhoods. And so people coming into Islam has a lot to do with the success of the Muslim community imprinting itself on the culture in Philly. But where the failure was is that the way that the foundation was set, there was never, in reality, in my estimation, and I could be wrong because I myself was born and raised in Philly, but I also left Philly. I could be wrong in saying this. Before, we have to understand the foundation in Philadelphia, specifically for the Muslim community, came from the Nation of Islam, and it came from the Dar. And those were collective groups. And on top of that, the Black Revolutionary Conscious community was also a communal type group, and the Black family that existed in Philadelphia, most of those families still had Southern culture. When I grew up in Philadelphia, us Puerto Ricans, we went to Puerto Rico, and the African American community, they went to the South. And that's how family vacations took place. And so you had a certain type of collectivist culture that was there. That broke down in the 80s. And whatever maintained, and whatever didn't, did it. But that was the foundation for the spread of Islam. But that broke down. So that crew that was necessary to really learn how to work with the people and take the dawah to another level and transform the environment, that crew doesn't exist except in pockets. And Philadelphia became a Salafi stronghold, and that appealed to brothers from the streets. That's why I don't knock that so much. That's why when people they knock the Salafi dawah, it's not necessarily that I agree with everything in the Salafi dawah. It's that I look at it from a sociological perspective. It's like the same way I look at the Nation of Islam. And I ask myself, what is it that was contributed by these groups to help the deen? Even if there was mistakes or issues or whatever. And so, but the Salafi dawah never accomplished social transformation. You understand what I'm saying? And what the Salafi dawah did was it accomplished some cultural shifts in Philadelphia. It accomplished some cultural shifts where you have the concept of the Philly beard, where you have the concept of pulling up your pants. You know, you had in Philadelphia at one time, you know, mostly on every corner between the Latino and the Black community, everybody had their pants legs lifted up because of the impact of Islam on the cultural reality. But it didn't impact 100% the psychology of the people. That's some points that I want to make. In addition to that, the point that I wanted to make was the issue of collectivism was existed at one time, that broke down. The second thing is where were the successes? A foundation was laid to open up the door for Islam and to impact the culture, but there was still a lot that was left. And so one of the things that we need to understand, and this is my challenge to brothers, and this is where the Water Deen community had more weight. When you keep talking about Tawheed, the only thing you're talking about is what Muhammad bin Abdul Wahab did, and you don't talk about what he did for his community. We may not agree what he did for his community, but Muhammad bin Abdul Wahab, he made sure that he went into an alliance with the House of Saud, and they established a political, economic reality for the Saudi tribe, which dominated other tribes. There was never any transformation on a higher level except pocket efforts. And those pocket efforts were dynamic in Philadelphia, by the way. When we talk about Imam Luqman, Kenny Gamble, and what he was doing in Philadelphia with housing and schools and businesses. You know, that was the carryover of what was coming from those people who had leadership skills, who came into Islam. That necessarily wasn't those people who were studying Islam and so on and so forth. You know, there were people that came into Islam and they had another type of mindset that they brought into Islam, and it was beneficial to the community. But we can't just talk about Tawheed without talking about economy. The first thing, if you don't want to talk about building community, you want to talk about going back to the Sahaba, right? And I'll speak to you in your language. If you want to talk about the minhaj of the Salaf, you know, when the Sahaba go into Medina, what's one of the first things that the Prophet ﷺ establishes before even establishing the Masjid al-Nabi? One of the first things that he establishes is a social welfare system, and that was in the Nidam al-Mu'akha and the Brotherhood Pact. And he paired people up so that they take care of one another. because they had a crisis on their hands. And the crisis that they had on their hand, or he had on his hand, was that he had all these migrants coming. They left their community and they made hijrah with him, and they were without housing, and they were without employment, and without wealth. And so that created a dilemma. What do you do with all these people? How do you integrate them? And so he had to pull from a crew that will support that community building effort. And he had in the Ansar, in the supporters, in the aiders, in the helpers, my brother's keeper. Someone that will step up to the occasion, that will take hand in hand their brother, share their wealth, whether in housing and in economy overall outside of housing, and give support to those that didn't have. That was before building the masjid. So what happens is that there's a lot of rhetoric that comes. And a lot of this rhetoric, a lot of times, is stereotypic generalizations about what the deen says. Tawheed. Tawheed was the first thing that people taught. Was it Tawheed the way that you're teaching it? The only thing that the first generation taught, and in what way? And give the dalil for that. Because that's not the case at all. You know what I'm saying? They weren't sitting around talking about, well, Tawheed is 3 parts. Tawheed is, Rububiyyah, Ilahiyya and Asma'i wa Sifat, and they had to watch Bid'ah, and they were practicing the deen, and they were on the Sunnah. That was not the reality. The concept of Sunnah that we have in our minds, and the concept of Tawheed that we have in our minds, is not what they were engaging in. The Quran came gradually to speak to their conditions and their situations. And that prophetic example was a living example. It was no bickering over hadith. Shaykh al-Albani said this hadith is sahih. Shaykh Muqbil said that. That wasn't the concept of sunnah that they had. And so the Quran directly addressed the conditions of the people. And the Prophet ﷺ wasn't just moving on the issue of depending upon Allah Ta'ala without taking the means, without addressing cause and effect issues. He operated on both. And we find that in many examples. And I'm not going to go into all of those details other than to say the fact that the Prophet ﷺ leaned on what later the Muslims, in my estimation, disrespectfully say is the kafir uncle of the Prophet Muhammad. That's the type of problem that we have in our attitude. Abu Talib, what he did for the deen, at the minimum, demands that our tongues are free from talking negatively about him. Because he did more for Islam than what we do for Islam. You understand what I'm saying? And so the Prophet ﷺ sought support. He had a support system. And so what we do, rather than try to have a support system, and rather than ally with our community of origin, and where there's good, we go back and we call them kafir. And we go back and we split our ties. And that's the type of da'wah that we teach to the people. Now, that may be appealing to people in the street, but that's not appealing to me. You understand what I'm saying? And it's not appealing to me as a methodology. That roughness and false toughness and the disrespect of other human beings. So that doesn't allow us to build the alliances which are necessary to build in order to work on real social issues. You can't expect people to carry deen day in and day out and they don't have a means or an income. You understand what I'm saying? I know brothers that they have told me stories that early on they've been caught in situations when they became Muslim years ago, and they came off of the streets and they had debts and they had issues and so on and so forth, and they had to pay things off, and if they didn't, they would get arrested. And guess what those brothers did in order to try to recreate themselves and try to live this new clean life of Islam? They went back into the dirt and they hustled on the corner of the block and they sold some drugs in order to pay off those debts, in order to try to carve a new change and go in a new direction. I'm not advocating that, but I'm saying that in the time period of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, zakat was given to people لقضية تأليف القلوب, to affirm people's hearts and to aid them. There was some sort of welfare system, and if we look at communities in the past, prior to the hit of drugs, people cooperated with each other. There was community building. So you can't talk about people coming into the deen and environments being sound and you don't have what it takes to build an environment. Just having the right aqidah in your head and hopefully it reaches our hearts is not enough. You understand what I'm saying? We have to have the ability to navigate in the society. And this is why we keep saying on a regular basis, those who negate the importance of understanding the human being in the life context, in the life world, in society, in community, in family, in real tangible conditions, they do a disservice to the da'wah and the deen. Because then that means that they're not addressing the situation of the person as needs to be addressed, and that goes against the minhaj of the Quran, and that goes against the minhaj of fatwa, and that goes against the minhaj of qada, of judgment. It goes against the minhaj of education and development, tarbiyah and ta'aleem, and even guidance when it comes to irshad. So as long as we have these conceptions of Islam which compartmentalize what it is that deen is, and as long as we have a tool of an ideological understanding of deen without being practical and dealing with the world, so that part which compartmentalizes means it only focuses on one thing and it excludes having to deal with other parts of life. That part which is ideological which is problematic. It means that it takes deen as ideas and doesn't have any real way to implement it. That's what's leaving our communities bankrupt. We want our youth to be on point, but then we don't have institutions for them. We want our men to be on point, but we're not addressing the economic issues. We want our families to be on point, but yet we can't solve the crisis of the family and what happens with single parent headed households, whether male or female, and the situation of poverty, and so on and so forth. So we can't escape dealing with those issues. My advice to people at this point is make hijrah. Go to another city. And Philadelphia is just one example. You know what I'm saying? My advice is pull out and go to another environment. To be honest with you, if you calculate the math of what people are spending in the city in terms of buying food, in terms of housing and all that, in many instances they're going to be in the same situation economically, but in a better set of conditions if they went to another environment. And with the crunch that's taking place, that is what many of us are being forced into. It's better to change your environment and be in more wholesome conditions and give the youngest of your children an opportunity to see something different, even if they have a different set of struggles, even if they're not around Muslims, than to be in an environment which is hostile and violent and death is lurking over your shoulder and is traumatizing and so on and so forth. But at the end of the day, there's another option. Get involved. Get involved locally. Organize your communities. You know what I'm saying? If you don't want to leave, then you're going to have to organize your communities. Then you're going to have to work with the locals. You're going to have to work with creating more safe environments. You're going to have to put in the work. And that is the reality at the end of the day. The choices are many. But the criticism that is waged in Philadelphia, as an example, Philadelphia is not the only case. There's a lot of cases like this. But it's not called for, because it means that we don't understand. I understand Philadelphian culture, or Philadelphia's culture. It's very powerful. You understand what I'm saying? And it's a very small city. It's not like New York. You know what I'm saying? It's not like New York or Chicago. Philadelphia is a smaller city of the bigger cities. It's like a bigger camp than New Jersey. You understand what I'm saying? And so that draws the people in, and it pulls them down, and it suffocates them. That's the reality, the way that the culture of the city is. But the economy, you understand what I'm saying, is the biggest issue. And if you want to take my analysis, I'll tell you this. The city of Philadelphia is overpopulated. It's going to be very difficult to come up with solutions at the level that we want in that type of environment, because it's overpopulated. And that means if it's overpopulated, the economy of that city can't sustain the people on an official legal level. It sustains people because the undercurrent, the illegal economy, the economy which deals with illegitimate stuff and so on and so forth, that's a very big economy in Philadelphia. And that is what pushes people through, and it makes things work, along with whatever government aid that people get. But if we want to talk about real solutions, then we're going to have to either organize and get involved, or we're going to have to leave and go to another environment. You know what I'm saying? That's talking about solutions. You know what I'm saying? Trying to get deeper underground. But in terms of our conception of Islam, we can't keep just talking about Tawheed, and we're not talking about any aspects of it. La ilaha illallah, understanding by itself is sufficient. All that in-depth talk about Tawheed hasn't gotten that city anywhere. At the end of the day, the conditions of the people have not changed. And that's a reality that we see, that we look at, and that we find to be extremely problematic. But that doesn't mean that we should negate or unfoundedly criticize the good that the people have. If people got their shahada, there's a good that's there. But when we start talking about building community, it's a little more complex than just sitting and reading books. When we talk about changing human behavior, it's a little more complex than just talking. You know what I'm saying? Those are more higher level things. And a lot of us, we don't realize that the dawah at that level demands much more than what it is that we're giving. When we talk about human transformation, and when we talk about economy building and sustaining life and stabilizing families and getting people out of addiction and addressing people's deficiencies, that's a higher level of education, higher level of knowledge. But one thing, I'm going to shut down this live with this saying: community is essential. And what we are doing is an injustice, because we expect people as individuals to make things happen. And Islam is not a neoliberal, individualistic, me, myself, I type of orientation. It's me, myself, I, and us, and we, and they. And, there's a community built into our relationships, is built into our worship, whether it's Salatul Janazah, Salatul Jama'ah, Hajj, the fast of Ramadan, Zakat, very community oriented, along with individual responsibility. And so when we start talking about the issue of individual responsibility, and we start talking about the issue of society's responsibility, for us is hand in hand. So our solutions and our thinking have to be on those two fronts, individual, community. And as long as we don't have that, it's going to be difficult to make some real moves. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.